Hello all, welcome to the Solocast of Firecode Tech. In these episodes, it's just going to be me, your host, Gus Gagliardi. There's going to be a range of topics, but I'm going to talk about specific technologies, installation standards, codes and how they work, as well as some other interesting topics that don't neatly fit inside of the context of a normal interview. Hey, what's going on? Welcome to episode 18 of Firecode Tech. On this episode, we are talking about UFC 3600-01, or more specifically, how to design fire protection for Department of Defense facilities. So the reason why I wanted to talk about this subject is because DOD fire protection is special in pretty much every regard. It follows different rules and regulations and has a lot of complexity to it. Also, there are extremely limited resources out there for people discussing fire protection for military occupancies. And so, I really wanted to speak about this topic because I had a heck of a time learning about it. So we're going to get into some of the fundamentals of DOD criteria when you use them, for what kind of facilities you use them, what are the baseline assumptions for fire alarm and fire suppression systems? But we'll see how far we get. This is quite a dense subject. So, let's get into it. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on social media so you don't miss any episodes. Oh, and give us a review on Apple Podcasts so you can help out the show. Before the UFC, each branch of the military in the U.S. had their own criteria. So the point of the UFC, or the Unified Facilities Criteria, is to combine all of the requirements from the Navy, Air Force, Army, Air National Guard, etc., to a large extent under one set of documents. When we're talking about fire protection for military facilities, we're really talking about UFC 3600-01. Right now we're on change 6, but the changes for the UFC criteria come out fairly frequently. So when I first started in fire protection, I think we were on change 2, and now we're on change 6. So over the course of 4 years, we've had about as many revisions to the Unified Facilities Criteria for Fire Protection Engineering. Interesting topic about UFC documents is that there is a hierarchy of applicability and order to them. The General Building Code document is UFC 1-200-01, and so this document is kind of the broad overview of the building code. And so the UFC uses a combination of the International Building Code and NFPA 101 for its fire protection and life safety documents. And UFC 3600-01 clearly dictates when to use these different documents. For hazardous materials, DOD facilities use NFPA 400. In contrast to the International Building Code, uses a combination of Chapter 3 and other chapters within the IBC. So it's a little bit of a different scenario because there are jurisdictions or places in the world that use only NFPA documents or only International Building Code with, reference standards, and the military uses both. And what I wanted to get to earlier about the hierarchy of these documents is there are 1, 2, 3, and 4 series UFCs. So 1-200-01 is the DOD building code, and 3600-01 is, so this is an example of a 1 and a 3 series. And so they start out broad at the 1s, and then they get more specific. A common 4 series document that I have experience using is 4-1101, which is the military standard for aircraft hangars. And so if there is a conflict in the information that's provided in the UFC documents, the one with the higher number takes precedence. It's more specific. So if there's fire protection density criteria in 36101 and 42111, then 42111 takes precedence if you have a facility that is a military aircraft hangar. So there are other UFC documents for mechanical engineering and other engineering disciplines, but for the purposes of this episode, we'll focus on UFC 36101. So the process of determining fire alarm and fire suppression systems for UFC documents is different than the IBC or NFPA 101 or 1. So let's talk a little bit about how to determine if you need a fire alarm or a fire suppression system for DOD facilities. So there are similarities and differences from the way that the IBC specifies a sprinkler system and UFC 36101 specifies a sprinkler system. So they're similar in the regard that there are specific occupancies that have specific requirements in UFC 36101 that say if you have this occupancy or this set of criteria, then you need a sprinkler system. But the way that they significantly differ from each other is when is the baseline building construction elements that require a sprinkler system. So in the International Building Code, we would have thresholds of building height and area that are, could be for 5B construction as much as 8,000 or more square feet before you start needing a sprinkler system, depending on your occupancy, of course. But for UFC 36101, starting at about 5,000 square feet, or even if you're looking at fairly non-combustible construction types, you are still in territory that could have a sprinkler system. So the military requires sprinkler systems for many of their buildings. And so for fire alarm and mass notification systems, so the difference between what the military requires and what the common building code requires is a fire alarm system for regular occupancies of this size. The military requires a mass notification system. This is a voice communication system with a lot more rigorous messages. There are conditions for fire and different events. And so the criteria in which you would find the requirements for fire alarm and mass notifications is 4-021-01, the design and operation and maintenance of mass notification systems. So the way you find out if you need a fire alarm system is completely different than the International Building Code, because essentially almost every facility needs fire alarm and mass notification if it is a facility that is using 4-01001, which is the minimum anti-terrorism standards for buildings. And so only situations I've found that are excluding fire alarm and mass notification systems are the extremely small or the extremely remote. The base can, of course, since they are the authority having jurisdiction, opt out if the base AHJ says that it's not required. So unless you're dealing with a extremely unoccupied and small and remote building, you're going to most likely have a fire alarm and mass notification system. So I've done this exercise many times for buildings that are extremely small and unoccupied, but the criteria for if a fire alarm system is required or not is in 4-010-01. And then the requirements for the component architecture and the different pieces of the fire alarm and mass notification system and where those go are located in UFC-4-010 021-01. So if you, an interesting additional portion of the fire alarm system that is in some military buildings, but not generally in commercial facilities, is textual notification signs. So these are signs that are located very similarly to manual pull stations in that you have them at exiting doors, generally above the doors or near the doors, and they will display pieces and portions of the fire alarm and mass notification system messaging. So say if you had a fire alarm, it might say fire or evacuate, or they could be static or they could be scrolling. So this is an interesting different piece or portion of fire protection design for fire alarm and mass notification systems. UFC 3600-01 has a similar layout as the building code, and that is a reorganization that has come later on in the document's history. It starts off in broad terms with scope and administration, applicability, purpose, criteria, and general building requirements in the first 1-1 through 1-5. And so these are kind of the same beginning chapters as you would find in the building code. Chapter 2 is definitions, and chapter 3 is use and occupancy. So these are similar to the way the building code is laid out, and so this was part of that reorganization. The reason why it's interesting to work on DOD projects, or one of the reasons why it's interesting to work on DOD projects, is because they oftentimes require a licensed fire protection engineer, not just an engineer that is qualified to practice fire protection engineering. So there are many requirements in UFC 3600-01 that kind of reference fire protection engineer who has passed the NCEES exam for professional engineering related to fire protection. There's been a recent trend in UFC 3600-01 to transition to the fire protection engineer being the kind of sole source for the fire protection systems and life safety for the building. This is a little bit different than how it works in commercial industries because oftentimes architects are charged with a portion of the life safety design, namely egress and building configuration, as well as sometimes things like fire extinguishers will be designated by architects. So when you're on a military project, especially, it depends on which organization you're working with. Sometimes they will opt to have the fire protection engineer be the sole source for the fire protection and life safety, and you'll have to even seal the life safety drawings or the G sheets with the fire protection engineer seal, which is a difference for sure from the commercial fire protection engineering. So here's an interesting section talking a little bit more about that fire suppression requirement that we were talking about earlier, and this is 1-12.8.1 automatic sprinkler systems. It says, for facilities that do not require sprinkler protection as required in the special detailed requirements based on use or fire protection systems chapters. So this is the equivalent of Chapter 4 and Chapter 9 in the building code. So detailed specific occupancy requirements and like the systems chapter of sprinkler systems. So it says the design fire protection engineer must determine if the sprinkler system or other fire suppression system is required for the facility based on mission, hazard of contents, value of contents, or other criteria. This determination must be included in the contract documents for design services or design build services. So this is an interesting statement because there are a lot of factors here that don't play in civilian design services. So mission, hazard of contents, value of contents. Generally, I mean, it would make sense that if a building was of a significant value or had significantly hazardous materials, that you would need the sprinkler system, but obviously there's a different flair to it because it's Department of Defense. Well, that's it for our first segment on DOD facilities and just dipping our toe into fire protection for facilities that use the Unified Facilities Criteria. And I hope you enjoyed it. And if you'd like to hear some more exposition on UFC criteria and system determination and design, check us out at patreon.com/firecodetech. Thanks for listening. Thanks for listening, everybody. Be sure to share the episode with a friend if you enjoyed it. Don't forget that fire protection and life safety is serious business. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are by no means a professional consultation or a codes and standards interpretation. Be sure to contact a licensed professional if you are getting involved with fire protection and or life safety. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.